Hello, everyone. This is not really Philosophy of the People, and Ben Burgess is definitely not here. It's also been a long time since we've done this because Ben has been busy and I've been finishing my PhD. But I will be handing in my PhD tomorrow, so I'm done with that. I don't know when Ben is going to be back at it, but if Ben is not back at it, then I'll just be doing this alone or with whoever I can scrounge up. Um, because I've now finished my PhD, but I have been working on it a lot this week. This isn't the most prepared episode, and as you might guess, it's driven by very recent events which have happened. To compensate from the fact that, you know, I'm not necessarily the most prepared for this podcast that I've ever been for a podcast. I'm putting the chat, such as it is, on the screen to hopefully compensate. And, chat chat is now my co-host. What I was kind of triggered specifically to talk about today is there's been a comparison made recently between what has happened with when Nasrallah has been killed. Nasrallah was killed. Was it just yesterday? God. Or was it Friday? Might have just been yesterday. Time is losing its meaning these days. People started to make comparisons to an event which happened in the Bush administration in 2002. In 2002, Israel killed the head of Hamas. And in doing so, they killed also around a dozen other people, including children. And at the time, this was something that was condemned by the United States. They opposed it and they condemned it. While a couple of days ago, or a day ago, again, I'm losing track of time, Nasrallah was killed in an Israeli operation which involved them dropping a bunker buster bomb in a busy downtown district of a major city. And not a major city in Palestine, but a major city in Lebanon, which there's kind of some impression that they're kind of slightly higher up the subaltern kind of hierarchy than Palestine is, at least. Initial Israeli estimates, this bomb took down, as I'm sure many people here know, took down 6 towers, 6 housing blocks with one bomb. There was no warning, or of course you wouldn't expect there to be a warning, but there was no warning or anything like this. And so you'd expect that the civilian casualties are absolutely enormous. But of course, we don't really know because it's 6 towers which have collapsed at a time where Lebanon and Beirut are constantly being bombed. And medics and retrieval teams are having to focus on places where there might actually be survivors, as opposed to the areas around this tower block where people have just been absolutely vaporized. And so there's been a comparison where people are like, oh, and the point being there is all this has happened, and then Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have said that this attack is justice. This is Israeli justice, this is American justice, to kill your enemy, and in the process, killing hundreds of its civilians by demolishing a downtown block. And of course, you think like, oh, imagine if Russia had done something like this, or imagine if this had been done to Israel. But I don't think you even have to make that comparison because, Israel is kind of the most favored child of the West. So you can think of like, what if Ukraine had done this? What if Ukraine had demolished a whole downtown block of Moscow in an effort to kill Putin or a similar figure? And of course, they'd be getting angry phone calls from the West immediately. But what I want to point out in the discussion of multipolarity, this idea of that we're going from a present, which is unipolar, where basically the world situation and structure was dictated by the United States, from I suppose, a bipolar world of the Soviet Union and the United States, though I don't think that word was used, to a multipolar world, which is meant to be kind of the future, where there's these different powers in different places in the world, when there's some kind of balance between them. And I think the point to make the comparison between why did George Bush's administration, not exactly a man known for his pacifism, condemn Israel in 2002 when they killed the leader of Hamas, but Joe Biden and Kamala Harris say that the killing of Nasrallah is justice? I think the kind of obvious answer to that is it's easy to condemn your allies, which are kind of a bit out there. There's various allies of the West which are kind of on its violent fringe in different ways. Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, who are also kind of geographically on the edge of kind of Western power, often go further or do things the rest of the West or this Western alliance or whatever don't like, or at least they don't want to be seen to be associated with. But increasingly it seems that when they do these things, they aren't condemned by the West, even in a purely kind of discursive kind of terms. And I think that the simple reason for why that is because you can really easily do that when there isn't a threat to your power. But as soon as there is a threat to your power, then of course, you're going along with Israel assassinating Nasrallah because, okay, hundreds of people died, but they were enemy civilians. They were enemy civilians, and killing Nasrallah helps you maintain the threatened grasp on power you have. I think, and this is kind of the basic point I want to make today, that I think people often imagine that multipolarity as a possible future will mean a reduction in Western power. In Western terror. It will mean a reduction in Western power, or at least a relative reduction in Western power. But they think that will come along with a reduction in Western terror, in Western violence, and Western murder. And I think even people who are critical of this idea of multipolarity, or are opponents of the idea of multipolarity, don't criticize it in these terms. They imagine that multipolarity will probably lead to a decline in kind of the West's power, like the West's ability or capacity or willingness to inflict violence. And instead, the problem with multipolarity is that will lead, for instance, to an increased ability for Russia to impose violence and terror and murder. But what I'd like to suggest is that no, actually, as Western power is more and more threatened, the West will become more and more terrorizing, will become more and more violent, will become more and more murderous. And I'm going to drink some water. Someone's dropped Jewish lobby groups in the chat. There was a moment where being associated with Israel was something lots of people in the West didn't want to do, both in terms of kind of like government officials and also kind of people who would be naturally inclined in normal circumstances to be their fans. And so I don't mean just like normal, ordinary people who, through this process of the past year of Israeli terror, have become less and less enthusiastic about Israel. But rather, I mean a different kind of cadre who are kind of natural allies of Israel, who are natural allies of their violence, but have been embarrassed by Israel. Because in the past year, the problem hasn't been, one problem for Israel, for the West, is that Israel appears murderous. It appears highly indiscriminate. It appears, just violent in like a cruel way, in a way because the West and the Western regime and the Western attempts to impose itself upon the world is, of course, very violent, there has to be a constant effort to make a distinction between what is good and bad violence. And the normal main point here that's constantly made by defenders of the West, by defenders of Israel, by defenders of the United States, is that the West is discriminate and its enemies aren't. The West is discriminate in how it uses violence and its enemies are not. This is, of course, aided by structural technological factors. The West is much more able to discriminate in who it targets with weapons because it has more precise weaponry. Hamas, there's a, Palestinian factions in Gaza don't kind of just randomly splay rockets out into Israel because they think that's the best possible strategy. Which is not to say that if they could, Palestinian factions in Gaza wouldn't intentionally target civilian objects in Israel. I'm not saying one way or another, but the simple fact is, with the capacities that these Palestinian factions have, they don't have a choice. They have unguided munitions, unguided rockets, fired from launchers, which are generally they're firing not just unguided munitions, but low quality unguided munitions from low quality launchers, from people who aren't really professionals, people who are very often killed. Like the life expectancy of the people who use this weaponry is very low. And they're constantly having to fire and move and fire and move, and all these kind of circumstances which make it much harder for Palestinian factions in Gaza to be more discriminate than Israel, or to be anywhere close to as discriminate as Israel is. And there's been a big problem for the West with the current war because Israel doesn't seem discriminate. It seems like they're indiscriminate in the same ways as their enemies are. And Israel has not just seemed indiscriminate, but basically stupid and cruel. From October 7th, which beyond being a great slaughter, was an enormous embarrassment. It was something that was not meant to be able to happen. Of course, on one hand, Israel portrays itself as a country which is constantly under threat of events like October 7th, but one had never actually happened before, apart from maybe some stuff in the 1970s, where there were random bus attacks and something, but nothing ever happened on the scale of October 7th. Lost my thread for a second. So Israel, the October 7th is meant to be kind of galvanizing for Israel, for support for Israel. But in fact, because it was an embarrassment, because it was something that was not meant to happen, it often had the reverse effect, where rather than making Israel into giving them a useful coverhood of victimhood, it actually just led to embarrassment and a wish to dissociate. But I think this desire to disassociate from a force which seemed indiscriminate and stupid and cruel and ineffective. I think a great deal of concern among Western elites about Israel is how ineffective it is in its terror. That they've managed to slaughter an appreciable percentage of the population of Gaza without actually achieving victory. It seems in the past that Israel has been able to achieve victory in Gaza without killing anywhere near the current amount that they've killed. But I think something discursively has happened where people have taken this embarrassment with Israel as if it was the same sort of moral condemnation that very many ordinary people have made about Israel. And so now, after the pager attacks, after the walkie-talkie attacks, where Israel managed to completely humiliate the structures of Hezbollah by getting high explosives undetected into every radio and every pager used by Hezbollah. And of course, the pager strategy was specifically adopted by Hezbollah. They were basically kind of, I forget the word, like funneled down into adopting the pager strategy because of Israeli penetration and surveillance of their normal sort of networks. They were funneled down this road by Israel, and then Israel has managed to get these high explosives into Hezbollah's communication devices and detonate them. And they left there for months. They were left there for months. These high explosives undetected by Hezbollah, and then they were detonated, and they killed very few people, but they maimed many, rendered them combat ineffective, and it was an incredibly useful spectacle of terror. Terrorism in its old-fashioned sense, where terrorism now just means violence you don't like. But terrorism used to mean when you use violence in such a way as to terrorize your enemy. And this had a really transformative effect, despite the fact that, it's not actually very discriminate, because they couldn't know who was holding these devices when they went off or anything like that. But rather, it was very useful because it made Israel look clever again. And it made Hezbollah look very stupid. And then over the next few days, Israel has been able to systemically eliminate basically the entire senior leadership of Hezbollah through a series of attacks, of targeted attacks. It's funny that sometimes they're like incredibly discriminate attacks, where Israel will just target a single room in a tower block, and sometimes they'll demolish the whole tower block. And in the case of killing Nasrallah, because they had to penetrate down into a bunker, they destroyed an entire city block to kill him. But these attacks are, discriminate or not, highly effective, and shows Israel has completely penetrated the kind of structure of Hezbollah in such a way as they know exactly where every single leader of Hezbollah is at all times, it seems. Regardless of whether that's true or not, the impression is given of that. And again, it makes Israel seem very clever and makes Hezbollah seem very stupid. And I think the point here is that this is basically, once again, given carte blanche to a great deal of people to again be Israel fans. Because the pager operation, the radio operation, the killing of Nasrallah, and the killing of the Hezbollah senior leadership, it might not be moral, but it's certainly clever, it's certainly effective. And that, in the end, I think is something which people care a lot more about, certainly within certain sections, than whether or not Israel is moral. Because there's one thing, which is to have these states like Turkey and Israel and Saudi Arabia who are meant to do the West's dirty work. But the problem with Israel in the past year in Western elite circles is it seems like it wasn't capable of doing the West's dirty work. And not only was it incapable of doing the West's own dirty work, but it seems they were producing much more dirty work that the US and other allies had to do themselves. they were producing problems, they weren't solving problems. And now, in the past week, Israel has turned things around. Instead, they're the problem solvers, not the problem causers. And now it's, again, very easy for people to like and admire Israel. Because, okay, they're killers, they're slaughterers. They've managed to match, just until now, it's been what, 5 days, 6 days since like the big war, the big fighting in the north kicked off in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. And in that time, they've killed more or less the same number of people as they did in the entire of the 2006 war. And that's without a ground invasion, which will be coming up soon enough. And a lot, obviously, Hezbollah seems weak now. And also, especially, Iran seems weak now. And it seems that these factions, these groups, had made a certain calculation. The calculation that they were forced into, because it seems to be the case from all indications, that they really didn't know in Iran and Hezbollah about the Hamas attacks on October 7th. They didn't know what Hamas was planning. And of course, it seems from the fact of how deep Israeli intelligence penetration is into Hezbollah, is into Iran, from the killing of Nasrallah, from the killing of the leader of Hamas that happened in Iran. It seems it's definitely for the best, for the best, pragmatically for the best for Hamas that they kept these facts away. But after October 7th, a calculation was made by Iran, by Hezbollah, that they could support militarily Palestine, Gaza, the Gaza ghetto, Hamas, without becoming fully involved. That Hezbollah could bombard the north of Israel and engage in like a minor tit-for-tat war, and because of Israeli commitments, because of US commitments, because of US decline, because of Israeli decline, Israel and the US would never really hit back, as long as not in a way which would really cause big problems for the axis of resistance. As long as they stayed within like a certain escalationary level. And the calculations proved to be wrong, basically. As it turns out, Israel and the US are not weak. They're not as strong as they once were, but a weakening doesn't beget peace, but war in terror. Because these hegemonic forces are not going to be willing to give up on the hegemony. The United States is not going to go quietly into the night. Israel is definitely not going to go quiet into the night. They have the least go quiet into the night government that they've ever had. They have a messianic government who just wants to conquer all their neighbors and thinks they can do that with violent force. And so far, it seemed in Gaza that this kind of program was running out, that it seems that they couldn't, even with maximal violence, even with constantly pressing the limits that even the West was willing to impose, Israel couldn't win the war in Gaza. But, and I'm not writing off Hezbollah here, things can change, but in a couple of weeks they've completely humiliated Hezbollah and proven once again the effectiveness of their violence. The decline begets violence because equations that could previously be forced by lesser means now require greater means. But if these equations are essential to the structure that we're talking about, they're not going to be given up. Rather, just the terror and the violence is going to be used. The security fence and the blockade was proved on October 7th to no longer be sufficient to keep the lock on the Gaza ghetto. So, terror and genocide is needed. It was proved in February 2022 that Russia can be no longer contained to their 1992 borders. But this did not mean appeasement, but it instead meant a continual escalation of the conflict with Russia, which continually makes no signs of stopping. The idea that the West would approve of, that Western weapons would be used to invade Russia, was something that was completely, like, even to speak the idea in 2022 would be completely ridiculous and is now completely acceptable. So that's on one hand. I want to suggest that multipolarity doesn't mean that we get less Western terror, but rather directly implies almost certainly that we get more. There will be at some point a turning point where, just due to a failure of capacity, if things go on the same road that we're going on, that at some point Western power will decline and, like, its violence will be limited by the fact that it's reached its capacity. But I don't think we're anywhere near to that point. And in the meantime, all the kind of demons under the bed, all the kind of possible terrors that were kept restrained because it was more important for the West to maintain its image, will be let out. Because, of course, the West has tried to rely on kind of softer forms of power in most of the world because it's easier. It doesn't require kind of a commitment. It doesn't require you to constantly fight back. Because, of course, I say, we'll continue escalating with Russia. But, of course, that's led to the far right winning across Europe. And I expect almost certainly that the far right will cook out, as they say, and will become NATOized. But it certainly does lead to popular resistance. Popular resistance that almost certainly gets filtered out by institutions, but it does lead to popular resistance. But as soon as this power starts to really be threatened, then, we just go to violence. I suggest that the other unfortunate fact is reflecting on what's proven to actually be effective in countering the West in the past few years. And I think it's then, if we make the comparison between Hamas and Hezbollah, the leader of Hamas was killed in Iran. Hamas in Gaza has proved to be resilient in a way which is almost unbelievable. A degree of resilience, and also not just from the military factions, but also popular support. I think polling in Gaza is finally seen. Recent polling in Gaza has finally seen a majority of the population say, actually, October 7th was probably a bad idea. But to achieve that fact, Israel had to slaughter 2 to 5% of the entire population of the Gazan ghetto. And all that time, Israel has failed to fully defeat Hamas. It's failed to stop rocket launches from Gaza. It has failed to kill the leader of Hamas. It's killed some senior figures, but compared to what's going on with Hezbollah, it's not nearly as many. In Hezbollah, compared to Hamas, you had a much better armed force. You had a great deal of experienced fighters with 10 years of experience in something close to fighting a conventional war in Syria, in the Syrian civil war. And they're being completely dismantled by Israel in very rapid succession, while Hamas, with far less weapons, far less military experience, because Hamas fighters, they've got very few opportunities to fight, and when they do, they almost certainly always die, compared to Hezbollah, who managed to get plenty of experience in the Syrian civil war. It's Hamas which has proven to be resilient because they've been built to be resilient. There wasn't really any other possibility for Hamas to be resilient, because they were inside the Gaza ghetto and they were forced. That's basically what they were just structured wrong. They were made like diamond hard by the pressures they were under. Somehow, the leaders of Hamas are safer in the Gaza ghetto than they are in Iran. They're safer than they are if they would have been in Lebanon, or in Syria, or Iraq. Something very similar is also true about Russia, which is proven to be resilient instead of military effective. As I've said many times before, it seemed before the war, everyone's predictions, including me, was that Russia would militarily crush the Ukrainian army, but then would be crippled by an insurgency and massive sanctions upon the Russian economy. But this proved to be directly the opposite of the truth, where the Russian army struggled incredibly and basically failed straightforwardly failed in setting out what they achieved to do, was never fully defeated in the field, but just didn't achieve the major strategic objectives that they set out to do. The 3-day thing, I think, is a meme. But it's now 2.5 years later, and the Russian army has still not achieved the objectives that it set out. And of course, that's come because the West has continually resupplied and re-upped Ukraine. But, that's not an excuse. But at the same time, while the Russian army has been proved to be very militarily ineffective, the Russian economy has proved to be very resilient. And also the Russian army has been proved to be resilient. This seems to be the virtue that you need to fight the West. Resilience. The Russian army, after humiliation, defeat, just keeps going and keeps going. And the same is true for Hamas. And, it may very well prove when Israel invades Lebanon that Hezbollah will prove to be highly resistant. But you don't want to be resilient, because for any Lebanese citizen, you want Hezbollah to have won the hypothetical victory where they forced Israel to the negotiating table after a rocket exchange across the border, inflicting basically no civilian casualties at all on either side. You don't want to win over Israel in some kind of interminable ground war where they slaughter and bomb and destroy Beirut and the Bekaa Valley and all these other places, and they occupy your country. And of course, I'm sure the IDF will be very generous to all the kind of Lebanese citizens who end up staying in the areas they occupy. Resilience allows you to tolerate and keep going when you're being slaughtered and terrorized. But you'd just rather not be slaughtered and terrorized. And ultimately, that's the situation that Israel is able to force upon their enemies. Israelis are not being slaughtered or not being terrified, but they are able to force this equation on their enemies. And structures like Hamas have proved to be very resilient to this slaughter and terror, but you'd rather much just be a winner rather than be resilient. That's all I had today, really. But now I'm going to reach out. Kraut asks, not saying it's wrong per se, but how would you even go about public polling in Gaza right now? They just ring up people's mobile phones. which plenty of people still have, and still going. It was interesting. I don't know if they've cut any more questions because I haven't actually read the most recent poll. But one of the previous polls had they were previously asking questions of like what the main TV channel you listen to is, but in the last poll I read, they actually dropped that question because electricity access and kind of digital, you know, whatever TV access is so low in the Gaza ghetto now that they just dropped the question about asking people what their main TV channel is because so few people are able to watch television anymore. But plenty of people are still able to use their mobile phones, which obviously we all know because every video of what's going on in Gaza is shown to us. I'm just checking. Do both chats come up on here? Yeah, they do. Did anyone else in chat say anything interesting? I specifically requested an active chat today, and then I haven't really got one. Well, I have. I mean, lots of people are saying things, but they're a bit fucking irrelevant. They're not really anything I can respond to. Like, I'm glad to know Orca has very thick hair. I also have very thick hair. But it's not something I can really make a substantive point about. The song's 4K suggests, they say, a wounded Western hegemony in existential crisis. And I just don't think the crisis is at all existential at the moment. Um, I don't think the West is in decline, but the West is still the most powerful country, and the countries which are possible. I mean, the main possible competitor of the West, China, is still pursuing a strategy which combines national self-development with kind of global development. Um, but there's basically no willingness in China at all to impose terror and violence in other places. I do often wonder if, whenever China does get into a conflict, whether it be over Taiwan or whatever. Oh, fuck. What the hell? Why did my video come back on? Oh, there. I see. I can't believe I became Toussaint for a moment there. I became a New Yorker. How terrifying. Yeah, I mean, Kraut did say something similar to what I just suggested there, that China doesn't have the means or ambition to become a hegemon. I mean, probably in a distant sense they have the ambition, but I don't think they have like the willingness or kind of the inclinations to do it. As I was going to say there, I've been thinking about how the fact is that the Chinese military has literally no combat experience apart from like fucking ancient boomers who fought against Vietnam, a conflict which notably China lost. So perhaps not the best experience. I mean, you can learn plenty from a loss, but Um, and you do think if a force like that gets into a war, how much of a disaster it'll be. Obviously, I mean, that's one of the things with Russia. Lots of Western commentators were like, well, the Russians are just going to do the same stupid stuff over and over and over and over and over again. And of course they didn't. Like, they did stupid stuff many times, and then they do new stupid stuff, but they do learn. And so if China got into a conflict, even with complete military inexperience, they would eventually learn various things. Um, But as a military competitor, China, regardless of kind of the fanciness of their weapons, which are pretty fancy, but I still don't think as fancy as the West, they have this massive problem of just not having military experience. Um, China just needs to get involved in some stupid proxy war just to get some, an experienced officer corps. Yeah, it is interesting now, Kraut, that it seems like the United States is increasingly cannibalizing allies that were previously untouchable. And of course, it's not just these allies seem willing to do this in some way. Like the Germans have completely tanked their famous industrial sector um, for the sake of the war in Ukraine, and without doing anything really to stop that. Like they haven't retooled all these factories to then become, the number one military supplier of Ukraine. Of course, that as a financial idea, it's not very good. Um, but it is this kind of direct industrial transfer where there's this decline in German industry, while at the same time, there's an increase in American one. And at some point, you do kind of run out of nations to imperialize. Um, but I think there's still plenty left in the West. And yeah, it's not a nice thought, but it seems clearly each day that there's just more and more conflict. There was a thing in the Horn of Africa where Ethiopia moved in and seized some airports in Somaliland, I think. And in 1998, that would have been like number one news. That would have been the biggest event in the world. That would have been a global crisis. But these days, in this past 2 years, in this kind of post-COVID age of just constant war breaking out everywhere, um, yeah, it basically went unmentioned. And I think the kind of as this taboo around starting wars declines, it just declines more and more rapidly. With each conflict, and this is also the other thing about multipolarity, right? As each new conflict starts, there becomes much less capacity for any global actor to manage these conflicts. So, for instance, in West Africa, countries have been trying to move from being dominated by France and the United States, but France and the United States then, in exchange for this domination, hold back these jihadist rebels. And in exchange for that, oh, sorry, that's the exchange. I explained it. That was the two sides. But the alternative to that is to get Russia Wagner guys in. And of course, because Russia's further away and just doesn't really have imperial ambitions in a traditional sense in Africa. Um, of course, I mean, Russia would be happy to do neo imperialism in Africa, but they just don't really have the capacity. But they do have this excessively large military force for a country of their size without the kind of compatriot economic force which goes along with it. Though that's changing in the past few years. And maybe Russia will finally, for the first time, get to actually be an imperialist power. But because Russia's military capacity is so stretched in Ukraine, they've had to pull Wagner forces out of West Africa. And so, the president of Mali's plane was just recently burnt down by Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda seemingly basically just wandered into the airport, which is meant to be defended by the presidential guard and Wagner, and they just kind of wandered in and burnt down the presidential plane. Um, so each conflict allows each other conflict to escalate, which just leads to this complete runaway effect, where we're basically kind of returning to a previous age in terms of global conflict. history is really starting again, and it really fucking sucks. Da, 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 da. Just reading chat. The Roman Empire is often my Roman Empire. I mean, we can say no Western intervention, leave the global South alone. But what do people imagine will happen in that case? Obviously, we can say that kind of the demons of ISIS, of Al Qaeda, of Islamists, and not just Islamists, but other various diabolic forces in the global South were produced by Western intervention. But if the West stopped intervening, it wouldn't be like these problems would just be solved. These people would still be there and would be terrorizing people, would be fighting each other. We can say that the conflict in the Horn of Africa was in large part produced by colonial circumstances, but that doesn't make that wouldn't reduce the casualties that would happen if Ethiopia invaded Somalia. Thank you for the congratulations on my PhD progress. Yes. Handed it in tomorrow. The only thing currently preventing me from handing in my PhD is I'm unsure which email address it's meant to be sent to. So I've contacted my department about that. Yeah, I think the Ukraine war might end, especially if Trump wins. And that will kind of deflate, I think, global tensions. But it obviously will give the US capacity to intervene in other places much more heavily. Though at the moment, to be honest, I think the US is still really focusing on the Middle East, despite the alleged plan of the US being an effort to withdraw from the Middle East in order to pivot to Indo-Pacific to confront China. Um, I've already offered Ben my PhD to replace the one that he lost to Dr. Haas. Hypothetically speaking, since we don't have a powerful left movement in the US, how should a workers' movement respond to this era of increasing global conflict? I think the basic position just has to be refusal. I don't think the other strategy, because there's a strategy of kind of refusal of pacifism, of pseudo pacifism, of non interventionism, and then there is the other idea which I've discussed, I think, on my previous solo episode, which is the idea of kind of, well, I can't remember what I called it then, but of anti-imperialism, of the axis of resistance or whatever, which is the idea that Western workers should not just refuse to participate in Western wars, but rather that they should actively support the enemies of the West. Um, and I don't think that's the right strategy because I think Islamism is bad. And I think regimes are bad, I don't think we should actually stand Bashar al Assad. Um, I think we should oppose him being blown up by a missile, but that's about as far as I will go with it. And then, so there's on one hand the fact that these groups which oppose the West are just bad, mostly. But there's also the fact of what will be more popular, what will be more acceptable, what will be more reasonable. Because of course, um, you know, me and you, dear listener, might have views on October 7th, which are slightly more nuanced than would be suggested in the media. But in the end, 99.9% of people, if they remember what October 7th is, because we shouldn't overestimate the amount of people who just completely miss these things, um, they're going to think it's really bad, really, really, really bad, and that anyone that participated in it is fundamentally basically evil. But then these same people would be happy to oppose, sending Israel another $9 billion in aid, which is what is literally and actually happening. Um, so yeah, in terms of opposition, like I think there's some reluctance, especially from anyone that's inclined to be like a bit ultra to just the non-interventionist pacifist strategy. But I think it's morally or whatever the right thing to do, and I also think it's the right thing to do, kind of pragmatically. If instead of Hamas, um, it was PLFP or a similar faction that was in charge, a communist faction that was in charge in the Gaza ghetto, if it was the Communist Party of Lebanon that was leading the resistance in Lebanon, then I think Western workers should directly support these forces. But in the absence of these forces, in the fact that the forces opposing the West are more often than not like nasty reactionaries or just kind of like grim, stale dictatorships who will engage in great brutality, and not even great brutality for some great end, but just great brutality to maintain your shit country as a kind of shit country. Um, yeah, I think the kind of pacifism strategy, the non-intervention strategy, is much more effective than kind of the anti-imperialist axis of resistance strategy. Yeah, I mean, I think on kind of investment, uh, there's basically just, if as long as we live in capitalism is compatible with us not invading Iraq, um, or whatever, I think that's true. It would just kind of restructure how capitalism works, but we can't get rid of within capitalism like economic imperialism. Economic imperialism, as opposed to kind of physical brute force imperialism, is just structurally necessary in capitalism. So I don't think Western workers should make demands that basically their states or their institutions or their kind of private financial stuff should stop investing in other countries, in imperialized countries in the global south, um, but should kind of reveal and critique um, how these relations go. Because of course, if if a socialist workers movement took over a Western country, they would continue to have economic relationships with third world countries, um, and you would just want a restructuring of how those economic investments and relationships worked, and you don't want them to be pure charity, and you want them to be done in relation to certain countries and not others. You want them to be done to the degree that you can with friendly, progressive countries, um, and not just continuing to prop up places which aren't. Which is, you can call it imperialism, I guess, if you want. Um, yeah. Someone mentioned, as a Palestinian Lebanese person right now, why wouldn't you oppose the West? And it reminded me of a thread on Reddit Ask Philosophy, which I answered a couple of days ago, where someone was asking, um, as an Arab, why should I support human rights? And they laid out kind of how human rights is abused basically as a discursive label or a discursive term in order to attack, basically as a weapon of I don't want to say words of violence or whatever, but is it like it's the wrapping around violence, actual violence. I think we should maintain the fact that only violence is violence. Words aren't violence, um, unless they're like words which are kill that man right from someone who has the power to order that. While the rest of the time they're kind of the wrappings around violence. But they were basically asking, why when human rights are used as this kind of wrapping around violence, specifically towards Arabs or in the Middle East in general, why should Arabs support them? Um, and the point I made there was we can talk about human rights in two senses. We can talk about human rights as they're used as a weapon by the West, and we can talk about human rights as the term is used in philosophy departments and in similar places. But the important thing in both cases is that neither time should being an Arab matter. If it's the case that human rights are used as a weapon to aid in oppression and violence and imperialism, then it shouldn't be anything about being Arab which should make you oppose that, but rather that's just a universal obligation to oppose such. And if what is used by philosophers, what philosophers, if what philosophers mean by human rights is in fact a sensible notion, a progressive notion, a useful notion for protecting the dignity and lives and happiness of people, then Arab or not, you should support that notion. Orca was advised by his Communist Party to lower his kind of power level as regarding the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which sounds sensible to me. The argument has been made that the state can be reformed, changed from good to bad. Do you have any reason to believe that such a reform can happen? Yeah, of course, because I know that the Russian imperial state um, was transformed by the Bolsheviks into a revolutionary progressive government, which had its ups and downs, and then had a very, 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 very big down with Stalin. Um, but that doesn't change the fact that there have been and are progressive governments and states which emerged out of brutal and terrible ones. Like Cuba is such an incredibly clear example. I mean, obviously, I don't know how infused people are about China, especially in the GTAA chat. Um, but China went from, in just a few decades, from literally like a feudal empire into uh, a worker state, whatever you want to say. So I clearly haven't watched TAA in a while or paid enough attention to the group chat or whatever. Um, there's clearly been a lot of ho discussion going on while I've been away, which is now the kind of focus or in group of the chat. Who will the modern People's Republic of China get into its first proxy war? Who knows? Um, but probably China will benefit from getting involved into a dumb proxy war. Um, it's hard to think really because I think China's just opened literally like its first foreign military base, or was trying to anyway in the Solomon Islands. Oh god, imagine they got into some like horror conflict in New Guinea or something. Yeah. Okay, I made it to an hour. Made it to an hour. I can stop. Yeah, I mean, I feel like China could have definitely pushed things much harder in Ukraine if they'd been so inclined and basically get away with it because there's really a limit to how much the West can impose on them. Um, but they may just be biding their time, or they may be total cope. But in the end, like I'm someone who's willing to be enthusiastic about China in the future, but I'm not currently um, particularly enthused about them. Well, it depends. What about? I mean, Joe, for the people who can't see it in the chat, asked. Some on the left see Hezbollah as a moderate resistance force, others see them as reactionary butchers. And how do you see them? Do you think they can recover? Well, I mean, they're kind of both. I mean, they're a right wing organization. I don't know if right wing's kind of the right word, but they're a conservative group who has also, been defenders of kind of multi-ethnic and multi-religious life in Lebanon and Syria. Um, Hezbollah notably kind of lifted the siege of various monasteries in Syria from the Islamic State, from other groups, and kind of defended multi-religious life there, while at the same time propping up a guy who is I'm not the biggest fan of, Bashar al-Assad. And generally in Lebanon has tried to build alliances which cut across the structurally highly sectarian. That was an incredibly weird pronunciation of sectarian. Sectarian life in Lebanon. There was a clip of Nasrallah saying, like, the Jews don't control the United States. The United States controls Israel. And Israel is just kind of like another imperialist tool. And this is all, good and correct analysis. But in the end, he's a conservative Islamic, probably not reactionary, but nothing beyond his personal virtues and his comparison to kind of the even worse people around them. I don't think there was much really to admire about Nasrallah or Hezbollah. uh, Being accused in the Facebook chat of supporting the Israeli Air Force. Okay. I'm going to go. I hope today was at least decently decent. I think I did all right. Next week, assuming Ben isn't back, um, I will have a much more planned. I'll bring the PowerPoint back. The PowerPoint was great, I think, when I did that. Everyone loved the PowerPoint. Next week, if Ben's not back, we're having the PowerPoint back. And it's going to be good. But until then, I will say, I mean, chat's been fine. The thing is, the problem isn't like at one level. I was like earlier, I was like more messages, but in the end, the problem is also reading the messages requires me to just go like for like long periods. So like, I need just like a couple of messages a minute, but they all to be like highly relevant. But that's of course not something I'll actually ask of you, and you may continue to shitpost as you may. But yes, I hope you all everyone loved today's episode of Stefan for the People. Bye.